the very end of April and on all the way through May, it's time to be doing any top working of pecans if you're going to be doing it. Now, the time to start is very critical. You want to wait until the trees have started growing and growing vigorously. That bark has to be active and it has to slip very readily. The best advice I can give you is don't rush the season, especially if you only have a few trees to do. If you go out, look at your tree, and you see the bark is just starting to slip, wait a few days. The better it's slipping, the more active it is, the better your chances are for success. One of the other keys to success is starting with good graft wood. If you were cutting your own graft wood, you would have had to have done this quite some time ago, back in winter when it was still dormant. If you buy your graft wood, make certain that it was stored properly. You want it to have stayed moist, and it should have been stored at a very cold temperature, right around 32 degrees. That's cold refrigerator temperature. You don't want to store it in the freezer, otherwise it will be killed. And also you don't want it to overheat. So especially on a sunny day like this, you don't want to take it out in a plastic bag and leave it in the sun. The heat will build up inside there and it can damage your graft wood. And you don't want to buy your graft wood and store it someplace where it gets too hot and stays too hot and dries out. If this graft wood dries out, or if it is frozen, or if it gets overheated for too long, it's dead. Nothing that you can do in the grafting process will make up for poor graft wood. So buy good graft wood and take care of it. Now we have two different varieties here. Now what we have right here, what we're going to be grafting is not pecan, it's black walnut. And we have two different varieties, we have Ogden and Thomas. Both of them can produce graft wood of about the same size. I've selected different size wood here. The Ogden is much larger. This is good size for the 4-flap graft, and we'll get to the 4-flap as the second graft we'll cover. The smaller graft wood is really better for the bark graft, and that's the first one that we're going to cover. So I'm going to put most of the graft wood back in plastic bags to keep them from drying out. Because it's sunny, make sure it's covered up with something to keep the sunlight out. First thing I want to talk about, there's two type of grafts that we're going to cover today. 4-flap and the bark graft. And they're used very differently. The 4-flap graft is usually used on small, young trees, ones that have a diameter anywhere from this diameter up to this diameter or slightly larger. You can get by with about a half a time, again, the diameter of your graft wood, of your sign wood for the stalk, and still make a good union on the 4-flap graft. If you have a larger tree, such as this one, a bark graft is going to work much better. You don't want to try using a bark graft on anything larger than about 3 to 4 inches in diameter. If you try and do it on a larger cut-off stump, then it won't heal properly. If you look at an older bark graft, you'll notice that most of the healing is right around where the sign was and out to the edges. And you can imagine if it was a very large cut stump left and just 1 or 2 bark grafts on it, it would take a long time for that to heal. The first step, we're going to put our graft right here. And the first step is rather radical. That's to cut off and leave a stump. Now you want to leave some branches lower down below where you're going to be grafting. You do not want all the vigor from an established tree like this going up through your graft, your new graft, especially the first season. If you get too much growth out of that graft the first season, it will tend to get large, catch the wind, and be pulled out and broken off. So you want to leave several branches below it to act as kind of pressure relief valves. Most of the growth you want to encourage to go out into those rather than into your graft. Second step, after you cut off your branch, just clean it up a little bit. Now if the bark is very thick, you can shave that off some. If you look down on it, right at the intersection, right where the inside wood joins the outside bark, is where the healing is. This outer bark does not contribute to the graft, sometimes gets in the way, and just kind of thin some of that off. Now you don't need a full stick like this for your piece of scion wood for the top. Just 4 to 6 inch piece is more than adequate. Always make sure that your scion piece is going on right side up. If you look at the buds, you'll see the leaf scar below it, and the buds are right above it. And always make sure that the leaf scar is below and the buds are above it, and that way you'll be safe. Now to cut the scion to fit, your first cut is a long sloping cut at the base. Try and make it as smooth as possible. You see a long sloping cut. Next cut is on the top. Make a smaller cut so that you have a chisel shape. The next cuts are optional, but the help is to make little side cuts right along the edges to expose some of that cambium right along the edge. This way you have your chisel cut and your side cuts. Now your scion is ready to place on your stock. Line it up where you want it to be and make cuts through the bark on either side of that scion, using the scion as a guide. Then you peel back that little strip of bark, and you can see the importance now of waiting until that bark slips easily, not only to get that piece of bark to come away easy, but that also means that the cambium is very active and it's going to heal very, very quickly and ensure your success of your graft. Insert your scion down underneath that flap. Cut off most of that flap, but so that it still covers that smaller half of the chisel cut. After you've gotten the cut made, just to make certain that that scion stays in place, we're just going to put a couple of small wire nails. Be very careful not to smash the bark too much. These are just very small, very thin wire nails. The actual size is not that important, just so that they're small. Put one down at the base to hold that little flap in place, and then one up higher. And this way, that scion is held in very firmly and right in place and in contact with those cambiums so it can heal together. If you don't do this and the wind shifts it or a bird lands on it and bends it over, you break any healing that's happened and you might lose your graft. Now, just as it is, the carpentry part we're done with, but now we have to protect that graft, make sure it doesn't dry out. First step in doing that is to take some aluminum foil, shiny side out. We're just going to wrap that around and form fit that right around our graft. Now what this helps to do is reflect out any extra sunlight, keep it from overheating. It does also provide some moisture seal, but it's mostly there to help keep it from overheating inside. Next, we just get a regular plastic bag, food storage bag, and tear corner off of it to leave a hole. We just place that over Then you need to seal up this plastic bag at top and at bottom. You can use string, or you can just use some masking tape or freezer tape, which is very similar to masking tape but a little bit sturdier and a little more waterproof. The paper tapes like the freezer tape or the masking tape are good because they will hold for a certain length of time, but being paper, they eventually do break down. So as that sign starts to grow, it isn't restricted by that tape. If you use electrical tape, something very sturdy, it won't break down, it won't let loose, and you can girdle your graft. Now we have a graft made, the carpentry is done, it's sealed in on the bottom. The last step depends on whether you can find it or not. That's getting orange shellac. This isn't lacquer, this isn't the type of finishes that you use on polyurethane finishes on furniture. It's orange shellac. The other types of finishes can damage the sign wood. The orange shellac does not. It's just there to give a coating, light coating over that sign wood, help keep it from drying out. This would be especially important out in western Oklahoma where there's drier conditions and more drying winds. Now if you find the shellac, you can just put this on with a brush. What I'm using is it's just a shoe polish container that's been emptied out, orange shellac in it, makes a very handy container, just to very quickly and very easily put on a coating of shellac. If you can't find shellac, you can seal the very end with any sort of pruning paint to keep drying from the cut surface. And very many people have success with just leaving the bark of the sign uncovered. As long as the stalk is growing well and it heals well, there shouldn't be much problem. The shellac is just an extra added advantage, especially under high drying conditions. Well, now let's go over and look at the 4-flap graft. The second graft that I want to show you is the 4-flap graft. It's also known as the banana graft by many people. And as I said, it's used on much smaller trees. Now the key to successful 4-flap graft is matching the size of your sign wood to be relatively close to the size of your stock plant. Now you can have the stalk be a little bit bigger, or actually the piece of sign wood can be a little bit bigger. As we get into it later, you'll see why there's a little bit of leeway there, but you still want it to be relatively close in size. Now on a relatively large tree like this, it's much too thick down in the lower part to be able to successfully do a 4-flap. So you have to move up the tree until you find a spot that's small enough to relatively match the size of the sign wood. And we're going to do our graft right here. First step, rather dramatic, just like in the bark graft, is you clip the top off. Again, we're leaving some branches below it to act as breaks, someplace for the vigor of the tree to go out into, so that all of the vigor does not go out up into the top. Next thing we'll do, once that's cut, we're going to cut ourselves a piece of the sign wood. And this is relatively the same size. It's a bit small, the stalk is a bit large, but I think we'll be able to make a good graft. After that, this is the step that I generally forget, but I'm not going to this time. I'm going to put a rubber band over it and just roll that down out of the way. And we'll get to what that's there for a little bit later. Now we're going to make 4 vertical cuts in our stock plant. We're basically cutting it in quarters. Come over here on the other side. Try and keep them straight. Make them a couple inches long. There. Next step, we're going to peel each of these. This will give us 4 flaps to peel back, and that's where it gets the name. Now, as you're doing this, try not to handle the inside of the bark too much. That's where the cambium is, and you don't want to get that covered with dirt, oils from your fingers. That will impede the healing process. Next thing we're going to do, peel those flaps back. And we got a wooden cone, the wood inside. We're going to get rid of that with a pair of clippers. And that leaves a hollow. Now we prepare the piece of scion wood. Again, remember to have the scion wood facing right side up. What we're going to do, we'll make 4 very shallow cuts. You're just getting, let's cut the piece of dry end off of there. Make 4 very shallow cuts. Now these will match the inside of those 4 flaps that we have on the stalk. And we're cutting just below the bark. If you look carefully, you'll see the middle part we've cut into a little bit of the wood, and here's the outside bark, and right in the middle is the cambium layer. Now we've got a lot of good cambial surface there, all up and down each of those 4 cuts. And we're going to lay that inside, and we're going to press those flaps right up tightly against it. Then we're going to take our rubber band and fold that up. Now we maybe get our scion here is a little bit small, but I think with a little bit of care in folding it there, we'll get good cambium contact from the inside of this bark on the stalk and those cut surfaces on the scion. Next step is to make certain that it's squeezed together enough to have good contact. And you can do that either with some masking tape or some string. I'm going to use surveyor's flagging tape. All I'm doing here is just wrapping that first turn around itself to hold it. And we'll just keep wrapping around, pulling it extra tight. Now the surveyor's tape will add a little bit of moisture seal, but mostly its purpose, get that wrapped again, is to hold the bark of the stalk tightly against that scion wood. If you don't have good contact there, it's not going to work. And just to make certain, I'm going to also put, since this is a rather thick bark, I'm going to also put some string on there just to make certain that that is fully tightened. Again, like I said, if those 2 surfaces aren't in contact, the graft won't work. So it's very important, if you're in doubt about whether it's going to make contact, take the extra time to put that extra effort to make sure it will make contact. Now this string doesn't stretch, and it will take a while to break down. So after your scion starts to grow, after a few weeks and it starts to heal, you may want to come back with a knife and just make a vertical cut to cut that string so it doesn't girdle the graft. That's all the carpentry work on this, but now, just like on the bark graft, we need to seal that to make certain it doesn't dry out. The steps on that are basically the same. Some aluminum foil, shiny side out. Just wrap that around and form fit it tightly. Plastic bag, again we tear the corner off. And we'll hold that up with some freezer tape. And the last step, just put on some shellac, or if you don't have the shellac, put a little bit of wound dressing on the very cut surface up on the top to keep from losing excess moisture up there. Now in both of these grafts, don't be surprised if on a sunny day you see moisture, condensation on the inside of this plastic bag. That's not going to hurt it at all. Within a few weeks, you should be able to see signs of growth. If you see the bark has dried out and is all wrinkled, that means that the graft is not taken. If it stays relatively moist and good looking, and especially if you start seeing some growth out of the bud, then you know your graft has been successful. You should be able to tell within about 4 or 5 weeks if the graft is going to take. By that time, if it hasn't healed, it'll start drying out. Important points in the aftercare: make certain that if you've used anything like the string or any electrical tape, if the graft takes, make certain that's cut vertically so it won't girdle the graft. Don't let the graft grow very much that first year, no more than about 18 inches. If it grows more than that, more than 24 inches, pinch it back to 18 inches, let it bush out, but don't let it get tall or the wind's liable to blow it out if you get too much foliage and too tall. Try and get most of your graft out of your lower limbs. These lower limbs will, over the course of the next couple of years, you'll want to remove them. So if you are going to do any top working, remember the basic steps. Get good sign wood, have all your equipment ready and handy so that you don't take too much time. You don't want those cut surfaces of the bark to dry out. And once you're done and have it put together, make certain you have good cambial contact, put on a covering to make certain that it doesn't dry out afterwards. And one other point, the foreflap and the bark graft both work well. It's interesting talking with people around the state. There's some people who have more luck with the foreflap and can't get the bark graft to work. And there's some people who have beautiful luck with the bark graft and can't get the foreflap to work. If you try one and don't have luck, try again next year and maybe try both of them, because as I said, some people have better success with one or the other. If you want to try top working trees, make certain you follow the steps right, and remember, the end of April and May is the time to be doing it.